A 12-year-old girl, no lawyer, no bodyguard, just her voice. She stood in that courtroom, looked the most feared Korean Mafia boss in Chicago directly in the eyes, and said 5 words that made every single person in that room stop breathing. This is Amara's story. Nobody in the Jefferson Park neighborhood of Chicago would have looked at Amara Johnson and thought, that girl is going to change everything. She was small for her age, quiet in the way that people often mistake for weakness. She wore her hair in 2 braids every single day because her mother said it kept things simple, and in their house simple was survival. Amara was 12 years old. She was the kind of kid who read library books, with cracked spines because those were the ones other people had loved the most. She kept a notebook, a battered green one, where she wrote down words she wanted to remember. Not just vocabulary words, words like dignity, words like testimony, words like unbreakable. She didn't fully know why she wrote them down back then. Later, she would understand. She lived with her mother, Diana, in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled like someone else's cooking and old carpet. Diana worked double shifts at a hospital laundry facility, coming home with hands raw from the chemicals, and a smile she saved only for her children. Amara's younger brother, Marcus, was 7 years old and had the loudest laugh in any room he walked into. Amara loved him more than she had words for. Their life was not easy, but it was theirs. Diana had built something fragile and real out of very little, and Amara understood from a young age that protecting it was everyone's job. She walked Marcus to school every morning. She helped him with his homework every night. She kept her grades sharp because she knew, with a certainty that lived deep in her chest, that education was the only door in their world that nobody could lock from the outside. People underestimated Amara constantly. Her teachers called her reserved. Her neighbors barely noticed her. She moved through her world like a whisper. But whispers, as Amara would soon prove to an entire city, can sometimes be louder than screams. Jefferson Park had 2 faces. During the day, it looked like any other working-class Chicago neighborhood, corner stores with hand-painted signs, kids chasing each other down sidewalks, old men playing cards outside barbershops. There was warmth here. There was community. People looked out for each other in the small ways that don't make news, but hold a neighborhood together. But everyone in Jefferson Park knew the other face. Everyone knew the name Jeon Hyuk-soo. He had come to Chicago nearly 20 years ago, a sharp-eyed young man from Busan, South Korea, with connections to one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in East Asia. He had built his operation quietly at first, protection money from local businesses smuggling routes through the port, the kind of slow, patient expansion that powerful men use when they want to own something completely before anyone realizes what's happening. By the time people understood what Jeon truly was, it was already too late to resist him. Now he ran the Jeon Syndicate from a glass-fronted office building on the north side that looked, from the outside, like a perfectly legitimate import business. He wore tailored suits. He donated to local charities. He smiled in photographs with city councilmen. And everyone, the businesses that paid him, the people who had seen things they couldn't unsee, the families who had lost someone to his quiet, ruthless violence, everyone stayed silent because silence in Jeon's world was the price of staying alive. He had been arrested twice in 15 years. Both times, witnesses disappeared, recanted, or suddenly remembered they had seen nothing at all. Both times, Jeon walked out of the courthouse without a single charge sticking. His lawyers were the best money could buy. His reach extended further than anyone dared to map. There was a saying in Jefferson Park that children whispered like a ghost story. Jeon doesn't lose. Jeon never loses. Amara had grown up in the shadow of that saying. She had seen the fear on her mother's face when his name came up. She had watched her neighbors lower their eyes when his black cars rolled slowly down their street. She knew what he was. She had just never imagined that one night his world and hers would violently collide. It was a Thursday in October, the kind of cold Chicago night that arrives without warning and reminds you that winter owns this city. Amara had stayed late at the public library, finishing a paper on the civil rights movement that wasn't due until the following week. She was like that, always a little ahead, always preparing, as if some quiet instinct in her knew that one day she would need every advantage she had ever saved up. She was taking her usual route home, cutting through the alley behind Morrow Street, when she heard voices. She should have turned around. Every single lesson her mother had ever taught her. Keep your head down, keep moving. Don't get involved in what isn't yours, screamed at her to turn around. But the voices were sharp and urgent in a way that froze her feet to the ground. She pressed herself flat against the brick wall and peered around the corner. 3 men stood under the yellow glow of a single working streetlight. 2 of them she didn't recognize, large men in dark coats, their faces blank in the way of people who have done violent things so many times that violence no longer registers on them. The 3rd man was on his knees on the wet asphalt. He was bleeding from his face. He was begging, and standing above him, perfectly still, perfectly composed, in a charcoal gray suit that had no business being in an alley at 11 o'clock at night, was Jeon Hyuk-soo. Amara had seen his face in a newspaper once. She recognized him immediately. She watched, barely breathing, as Jeon leaned down and spoke quietly to the kneeling man. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw what happened next, and she would never, for the rest of her life, be able to unsee it. She ran. She ran all the way home and sat in the bathroom with the door locked for an hour, shaking, telling herself that she had seen nothing, that she would say nothing, that this was not her fight and not her burden. But 2 days later, a detective named Rosa Medina knocked on their apartment door. The man from the alley, a mid-level accountant named David Cho, who had been skimming money from the syndicate's books, had been found. The case had a single fragile lead, a library security camera. 2 blocks from the alley had captured the image of a young girl running at full speed at 11:04 p.m., coming from the direction of Morrow Street. Detective Medina was gentle. She sat across from Amara at their small kitchen table and explained, carefully and honestly, what it would mean to come forward. She also explained what it would mean to have a witness, a real witness, the first credible one in 15 years, against Jeon Hyuk-soo. Amara looked at her mother. Diana's face was pale with terror. And yet, Amara opened her mouth and said, "I'll tell you what I saw." Within a week, their apartment building's front door lock was broken and never fixed. Within 2 weeks, someone had slipped a folded piece of paper under their door that had nothing writ, 10 on it. Just a photograph of Marcus walking out of his school, laughing at something a friend had said. No message needed. The message was already perfect. Diana pulled Amara into the kitchen that night and held both her hands and begged her, not angrily, with a desperation that was worse than anger. "Baby, please, please let this go. We are not the ones who are supposed to fix this. We are not the ones with power here." Amara held her mother's hands and felt the rawness of them, the years of hard work in every callus, and she didn't say anything, because she didn't want to lie to her mother, and she wasn't ready to let go. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a tired-looking man named Gerald Fitch, called Detective Medina and strongly suggested that building a case around a 12-year-old witness from Jefferson Park was, in his words, an exercise in embarrassment. Jeon's lawyers filed motion after motion, each one designed to delay, exhaust, and intimidate. One of them approached Diana outside the hospital where she worked and handed her a business card, not with a threat, just a name and a number, and a quiet suggestion that there were other ways to resolve this situation for everyone involved. The community offered its own version of pressure. Neighbors who had known Amara her whole life avoided her eyes in the hallway. A woman on the 2nd floor told Diana plainly that she respected her but that her daughter was going to get them all killed. Even the librarian who had always saved new books for Amara looked at her differently now, with a kind of sad pity, as though she were already mourning her. Amara wrote in her green notebook every night. She wrote down everything she remembered from the alley, every detail, the exact color of Jeon's suit, The way the streetlight caught the puddle on the ground, the sound of David Cho's voice when he begged. She wrote T all down because she was terrified that fear would eventually hollow it out of her memory and she would lose the only thing she had, the truth. One night she wrote a single sentence at the top of a clean page and underlined it 3 times. The only thing that has ever silenced people like him is someone who refuses to be silent. She stared at it for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and went to sleep. The morning of the trial, Diana braided Amara's hair in silence. Neither of them ate breakfast. Marcus was staying with their aunt across town. Diana had made sure of that, had held him an extra long time when she dropped him off, burying her face in his neck the way mothers do when they need to store up courage. Outside their apartment window, Chicago was gray and sharp-edged, the kind of morning that felt like a warning. The courthouse was a tall, cold building that smelled of floor wax and old paper. Amara had never been inside one before. She walked in beside Detective Medina and felt the weight of every stare in the lobby. Court officers, journalists, people in suits whose allegiances she couldn't read. She kept her eyes forward and her hands loose at her sides the way she did when she walked through parts of the neighborhood that made her nervous. Don't show the fear. Don't let it own your body. Jeon Hyuk-soo arrived with 4 lawyers and 2 assistants. He wore a navy blue suit and looked, in every possible way, like a man who owned the room he walked into. He didn't look at Amara when he entered. That somehow was worse than if he had. It meant she wasn't worth acknowledging. It meant he had already decided how this would end. The courtroom filled. Journalists, community members, a handful of people from Jefferson Park who had come. Amara wasn't sure if they came to support her or to watch her fail. The judge, a formidable woman named Judge Patrick. Owens entered and the room stood. She had a reputation for running a tight courtroom and tolerating nothing from either side, Amara decided, in that moment, to trust her. The prosecution laid out its case carefully. Detective Medina testified to the timeline, the camera footage, the physical evidence recovered near the alley. It was solid but circumstantial. Everyone in the room knew it. The real weight of this case lived entirely in what the 12-year-old girl in the second row was about to say. When Amara's name was called, the room seemed to inhale. She walked to the stand slowly and sat down. She was small in the large witness chair. Her feet didn't quite reach the floor, but she sat straight, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes calm. Gerald Fitch walked her gently through her testimony. She answered every question in a clear, even voice. She described what she saw with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it 10,000 times, because she had. Every detail from her green notebook, perfectly preserved. The defense attorney, a tall man named Lawrence Bay, who had dismantled witnesses in courtrooms across the country, rose for cross-examination with the smooth confidence of a man who considered this the easy part of his day. He was polite at first. He questioned her timeline, her distance from the scene, the lighting conditions in the alley. He suggested gently that fear can distort memory, that darkness plays tricks, that a 12-year-old girl running home late at night frightened might have, understandably, forgivably, misidentified what she saw. Amara listened to every question without flinching. Then Bay made his mistake. He leaned forward, his voice shifting to something harder, and said loudly enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "Isn't it true that you have every reason to want attention and no real reason to be believed?" "They are." Bristled. Judge Owens looked up sharply, and Amara Johnson looked Lawrence Bay directly in the eyes and smiled. The smile wasn't defiant, it wasn't angry. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting, with enormous patience, for exactly this moment to arrive. She leaned forward slightly toward the microphone, the way she had seen speakers do at school assemblies when they wanted everyone to hear something important. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with low, tense energy for hours, went completely, utterly silent. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of a room holding its breath. Amara spoke. "Mr. Bay," she said, her voice steady and clear as a bell, "you asked if I have a reason to be believed. I want to answer that honestly." She paused. 1 beat, 2. I am 12 years old. I live in a neighborhood where people have been afraid of your client for 20 years. My mother works herself to exhaustion so that my brother and I can have something better. In the past month, someone photographed my 7-year-old brother outside his school and slid the picture under our door. I have not slept a full night since October. I have been called a liar by men in expensive suits, and I have been told by almost everyone I know that I should be quiet and invisible and let this go. Her voice didn't waver. Not once. So no, I don't have power. I don't have lawyers. I don't have money. What I have is exactly what I saw, exactly as I saw it, preserved in my memory and in my own handwriting, every single detail, because I knew that the only weapon I had was the truth told clearly. And the reason you should believe me, Mr. Bay, the only reason that matters is that everything I have told this court today is the truth, and the truth doesn't need a reason to be believed. It just needs someone brave enough to say it out loud. The silence that followed was not a breath. Pause. It stretched across the entire courtroom like a physical thing, thick and electric and total. Lawrence Bay stood completely still. For the first time in the trial, he had no follow-up question. He turned, almost involuntarily, and looked at his client, Jeon Hyuk-soo, the man who had never lost, whose name was whispered like a ghost story, who had walked out of 2 courtrooms untouched, was staring at Amara Johnson with an expression that nobody in that room had ever seen on his face before. It was not rage. It was not contempt. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who has just understood too late that he has fundamentally miscalculated the person sitting across from him. Judge Owens lowered her glasses and looked at Lawrence Bay. Does the defense have further questions for this witness? A long pause. Then Bai said, very quietly, "No, Your Honor." 3 rows back, Diana Johnson pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders shook, and somewhere in the gallery someone began to clap. Slow, then faster, and within seconds the entire room had joined them, until Judge Owens had to call for order 3 times before the room finally, reluctantly, went still. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Amara spent most of that time in a small waiting room with Detective Medina, drinking bad vending machine, hot chocolate, and rereading the same page of a book she hadn't been able to absorb since October. Diana sat beside her, their shoulders touching, not saying much. There was nothing left to say. Everything that needed to be done had already been done. When the jury returned, the verdict was read in a courtroom so packed that people were standing in the back. Guilty on 3 counts. Jeon Hyuk-soo was remanded into custody immediately. His lawyers were already filing appeals before the gavel fell. But everyone in that room, everyone who had followed the case, everyone who had watched a 12-year-old girl from Jefferson Park sit in that witness chair and refuse to break, knew that something had fundamentally shifted. The news spread through Jefferson Park within the hour. People came out of their apartments and stood on their stoops, talking, some of them crying, and the way communities do when something they had stopped believing was possible suddenly becomes real. The old men outside the barber shop shook their heads slowly, not in disbelief, but in the way of people who have just witnessed something they will describe to their grandchildren. Detective Medina, walking out of the courthouse, stopped and took Amara's hand and held it for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, simply, "I have been doing this job for 18 years. I have never seen anything like you." Amara's school gave her a standing ovation the following Monday. She accepted it with the same quietness with which she had accepted everything else, graciously, without vanity, already looking ahead. But the moment Amara would remember for the rest of her life was not the verdict. It was later that evening, walking home with her mother and her brother Marcus, who had been brought back that afternoon, and told only that everything was okay now. He held Amara's hand the whole way home, swinging it the way 7-year-olds do, talking about something funny that had happened at their aunt's house. The street lights came on one by one above them. Amara looked up at them and breathed. And for the first time in months, she felt the weight leave her shoulders completely. There is a version of this story where Amara stays quiet, where fear wins, as it had won in that neighborhood for 20 years. Where a little girl decides that the cost of speaking truth is simply too high and no one could ever blame her for it. But she didn't stay quiet, and that decision, made not in a moment of dramatic heroism, but in the quiet of a bathroom floor, in a battered green notebook, in a voice that refused to shake even when everything inside her was shaking. That decision changed her world. It changed her neighborhood. And it reminded every single person in that courtroom, and everyone watching this right now, of something that power and money and intimidation can never fully extinguish. The truth spoken clearly by someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose is still the most powerful thing in any room. Amara Johnson didn't win because she was fearless. She won because she was afraid, and she spoke anyway. That is not a small thing. That is everything. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or someone else's courage you've witnessed, let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you're new here, subscribe and stay close, because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things simply by refusing to be silent. Thank you for watching. Until next time, be brave.